Chapter 32 of Effi Briest by Theodor FONTANE, translated by William Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Chapter 32 3 years had passed, and for almost that length of time Effi had been living in a small apartment on Königsgraet Street, a front room and a back room, behind which was the kitchen with the servant's bedroom, everything as ordinary and commonplace as possible. And yet it was an unusually pretty apartment that made an agreeable impression on everybody who saw it, the most agreeable perhaps on old Dr. Rummschuttel, who called now and then and had long ago forgiven the poor young wife, not only for the rheumatism and neuralgia farce of bygone years, but also for everything else that had happened in the meantime, if there was any need of forgiveness on his part, considering the very different cases he knew about. He was now far along in the 70s, but whenever Effi, who had been ailing considerably for some time, wrote a letter asking him to call, he came the following forenoon and would not listen to any excuses for the number of steps he had to climb. No excuse, please, dear, most gracious lady, for in the first place it is my calling, and in the second I am happy and almost proud that I am still able to climb the 3 flights so well. If I were not afraid of inconveniencing you, since, after all, I come as a physician and not as a friend of nature or a landscape enthusiast, I should probably come oftener, merely to see you and sit down for a few minutes at your back window. I don't believe you fully appreciate the view." "Oh, yes, I do," said Effi, but Rummschuttel, not allowing himself to be interrupted, continued: "Please, most gracious lady, step here just for a moment, or allow me to escort you to the window. Simply magnificent again today. Just see the various railroad embankments, 3, no, 4, and how the trains glide back and forth continually, and now that train yonder disappears again behind a group of trees. Really magnificent. And how the sun shines through the white smoke. If St. Matthew's churchyard were not immediately behind it, it would be ideal." "I like to look at churchyards." "Yes, you dare say that, but how about us? We physicians are unavoidably confronted with the question, might there perhaps not have been some fewer graves here? However, most gracious lady, I am satisfied with you, and my only complaint is that you will not listen to anything about Ems. For your catarrhal affections—" Effi remained silent. "Ems would work miracles. But as you don't care to go there, and I understand your reasons, drink the water here. In 3 minutes you can be in the Prince Albrecht garden, and even if the music and the costumes and all the diversions of a regular watering place promenade are lacking, the water itself, you know, is the important thing." Effi was agreed, and Rummschuttel took his hat and cane, but stepped once more to the window. "I hear people talking about a plan to terrace the hill of the Holy Cross. God bless the city government. Once that bare spot yonder is greener, a charming apartment, I could almost envy you. By the way, gracious lady, I have been wanting for a long time to say to you, you always write me such a lovely letter. Well, who wouldn't enjoy that? But it requires an effort each time. Just send Roswitha for me." "Just send Roswitha for me," Rummschuttel had said. Why, was Roswitha at Effi's? Instead of being on Keith Street, was she on Königsgraet Street? Certainly she was, and had been for a long time, just as long as Effi herself had been living on Königsgraet Street. 3 days before they moved, Roswitha had gone to see her dear mistress, and that was a great day for both of them, so great that we must go back and tell about it. The day that the letter of renunciation came from Hohen Cremmen and Effi returned from Ems to Berlin, she did not take a separate apartment at once, but tried living in a boarding house, which suited her tolerably well. The 2 women who kept the boarding house were educated and considerate, and had long ago ceased to be inquisitive. Such a variety of people met there that it would have been too much of an undertaking to pry into the secrets of each individual. Such things only interfered with business. Effi, who still remembered the cross questionings to which the eyes of Mrs. Zwicker had subjected her, was very agreeably impressed with all the reserve of the boarding-house keepers. But after 2 weeks had passed she felt plainly that she could not well endure the prevailing atmosphere of the place, either the physical or the moral. There were usually 7 persons at the table. Beside Effi and one of the landladies, the other looked after the kitchen, there were 2 Englishwomen, who were attending the university, a noblewoman from Saxony, a very pretty Galician Jewess, whose real occupation nobody knew, and a precentor's daughter from Polzin in Pomerania, who wished to become a painter. That was a bad combination, and the attempts of each to show her superiority to the others were unrefreshing. Remarkable to relate, the Englishwomen were not absolutely the worst offenders, but competed for the palm with the girl from Polzin, who was filled with the highest regard for her mission as a painter. Nevertheless, Effi, who assumed a passive attitude, could have withstood the pressure of this intellectual atmosphere if it had not been combined with the air of the boarding-house, speaking from a purely physical and objective point of view. What this air was actually composed of was perhaps beyond the possibility of determination, but that it took away sensitive Effi's breath was only too certain, and she saw herself compelled for this external reason to go out in search of other rooms, which she found comparatively near by in the above described apartment on Königgrätz Street. She was to move in at the beginning of the autumn quarter, and had made the necessary purchases, and during the last days of September counted the hours till her liberation from the boarding-house. On one of these last days, a quarter of an hour after she had retired from the dining-room, planning to enjoy a rest on a sea-grass sofa covered with some large-figured woolen material, there was a gentle rap at her door. "Come in." One of the housemaids, a sickly-looking person in the middle 30s, who by virtue of always being the hall of the boarding-house carried the atmosphere stored there with her everywhere, in her wrinkles, entered the room and said, "I beg your pardon, gracious lady, but somebody wishes to speak to you." "Who?" "A woman." "Did she tell you her name?" "Yes, Roswitha." Before Effi had hardly heard this name she shook off her drowsiness, sprang up, ran out into the corridor, grasped Roswitha by both hands and drew her into the room. "Roswitha! You! Oh, what joy! What do you bring? Something good, of course. Such a good old face can bring only good things. Oh, how happy I am! I could give you a kiss. I should not have thought such joy could ever come to me again. You good old soul, how are you anyhow? Do you still remember how the ghost of the Chinaman used to stalk about? Those were happy times. I thought then they were unhappy, because I did not know the hardness of life. Since then I have come to know it. Oh, there are far worse things than ghosts. Come, my good Roswitha, sit down by me and tell me. Oh, I have such a longing. How is Annie?" Roswitha was unable to speak, and so she let her eyes wander about the strange room, whose grey and dusty-looking walls were bordered with narrow gilt moulding. Finally she found herself and said that his lordship was back from Glatz, that the old Emperor had said 6 weeks were quite sufficient imprisonment in such a case, and she had only waited for his lordship's return on Annie's account, who had to have some supervision. Johanna was no doubt a proper person, but she was still too pretty and too much occupied with herself, and God only knows what all she was thinking about. But now that his lordship could again keep an eye on Annie and see that everything was right, she herself wanted to try to find out how her ladyship was getting on. "That is right, Roswitha." "And I wanted to see whether your ladyship lacked anything, and whether you might need me. If so, I would stay right here and pitch in and do everything and see to it that your Ladyship was getting on well again." Effi had been leaning back in the corner of the sofa with her eyes closed, but suddenly she sat up and said: "Yes, Roswitha, what you were saying there is an idea, there is something in it, for I must tell you that I am not going to stay in this boarding house. I have rented an apartment farther down the street and have bought furniture, and in 3 more days I shall move in. And if, when I arrive there, I could say to you, 'No, Roswitha, not there, the wardrobe must stand here and the mirror there,' why, that would be worth while and I should like it. Then when we got tired of all the drudgery I should say, 'Now, Roswitha, go over there and get us a decanter of Munich beer, for when one has been working one is thirsty for a drink. And if you can, bring us also something good from the Habsburg restaurant. You can return the dishes later.' Yes, Roswitha, when I think of that it makes my heart feel a great deal lighter. But I must ask you whether you have thought it all over. I will not speak of Annie, to whom you are so attached, for she is almost your own child. Nevertheless, Annie will be provided for, and Johanna is also attached to her, you know. So leave her out of the consideration. But if you want to come to me, remember how everything has changed. I am no longer as I used to be. I have now taken a very small apartment, and the porter will doubtless pay but little attention to you and me. Always have what we used to call our Thursday meal, because that was cleaning day, do you remember? And do you remember how good Mr. Gieshübler once came in and was urged to sit down with us, and how he said he had never eaten such a delicate dish? You probably remember he was always so frightfully polite, but really he was the only human being in the city who was a connoisseur in matters of eating. The others called everything fine." Roswitha was enjoying every word and could already see everything running smoothly when Effi again said: "Have you considered all this? For while it is my own household, I must not overlook the fact that you have been spoiled these many years, and formerly no questions were ever asked, for we did not need to be saving. But now I must be saving, for I am poor and have only what is given me, you know, remittances from Hohen Cremmen. My parents are very good to me, so far as they are able, but they are not rich. And now tell me what you think." "That I shall come marching along with my trunk next Saturday, not in the evening, but early in the morning, and that I shall be there when the settling process begins, for I can take hold quite differently from your Ladyship." "Don't say that, Roswitha, I can work too. One can do anything when obliged to." "And then your Ladyship doesn't need to worry about me, as though I might think that is not good enough for Roswitha. For Roswitha, anything is good that she has to share with your Ladyship, and most to her liking would be something sad. Yes, I look forward to that with real pleasure. Your Ladyship shall see I know what sadness is. Even if I didn't know, I should soon find out. I have not forgotten how I was sitting there in the churchyard, all alone in the world, thinking to myself it would probably be better if I were lying there in a row with the others. Who came along? Who saved my life? Oh, I have had so much to endure. That day when my father came at me with the red-hot tongs." "I remember, Roswitha." "Well, that was bad enough, but when I sat there in the churchyard, so completely poverty-stricken and forsaken, that was worse still. Then your Ladyship came. I hope I shall never go to heaven if I forget that." As she said this, she arose and went toward the window. "Oh, your Ladyship must see him too." Effi stepped to the window. Over on the other side of the street sat Rollo, looking up at the windows of the boarding house. A few days later Effi, with the aid of Roswitha, moved into the apartment on Königgrätz Street, and liked it there from the beginning. To be sure, there was no society, But during her boarding-house days she had derived so little pleasure from intercourse with people that it was not hard for her to be alone, at least not in the beginning. With Roswitha it was impossible, of course, to carry on an aesthetic conversation, or even to discuss what was in the paper, but when it was simply a question of things human, and Effi began her sentence with, "Oh, Roswitha, I am again afraid," then the faithful soul always had a good answer ready, always comfort and usually advice. Until Christmas they got on excellently. But Christmas Eve was rather sad, and when New Year's Day came Effi began to grow quite melancholy. It was not cold, only drizzly and rainy, and if the days were short, the evenings were so much the longer. What was she to do? She read, she embroidered, she played solitaire, she played Chopin, but nocturnes were not calculated to bring much light into her life, and when Roswitha came with the tea tray and placed on the table, beside the tea service, 2 small plates with an egg and a Vienna cutlet carved in small slices, Effi said as she closed the piano, "Move up, Roswitha, keep me company." Roswitha joined her. "I know your Ladyship has been playing too much again. Your Ladyship always looks like that and has red spots. The doctor forbade it, didn't he?" "Ah, Roswitha, it is easy for the doctor to forbid, and also easy for you to repeat everything he says. But what shall I do? I can't sit all day at the window and look over at Christ Church. Sundays, during the evening service, when the windows are lighted up, I always look over that way, but it does me no good, it always makes my heart feel heavier." "Well, then, your Ladyship ought to go to church. Your Ladyship has been there once." "Oh, many a time, but I have derived little benefit from it. He preaches quite well and is a very wise man, and I should be happy if I knew the 100th part of it all, but it seems as though I were merely reading a book. Then when he speaks so loud and saws the air and shakes his long black locks, I am drawn entirely out of my attitude of worship." "Out of?" Effi laughed. "You think I hadn't got into such an attitude. That is probably true, but whose fault is it? Certainly not mine. He always talks so much about the Old Testament. Even if that is very good, it doesn't edify me. Anyhow, this everlasting listening is not the right thing. You see, I ought to have so much to do that I should not know whither to turn. That would suit me. Now there are societies where young girls learn housekeeping or sewing, or to be kindergarten teachers. Have you ever heard of these?" "Yes, I once heard of them. Once upon a time little Annie was to go to a kindergarten." "Now you see, you know better than I do. I should like to join some such society where I could make myself useful. But it is not to be thought of. The women in charge wouldn't take me, they couldn't. That is the most terrible thing of all, that the world is so closed to one that it even forbids one to take part in charitable work. I can't even give poor children a lesson after hours to help them catch up." "That would not do for your Ladyship. The children always have such greasy shoes on, and in wet weather there is so much steam and smoke, your Ladyship could never stand it." Effi smiled. "You're probably right, Roswitha, but it is a bad sign that you should be right, and it shows me that I still have too much of the old Effi in me, and that I am still too well off." Roswitha would not agree to that. "Anybody as good as your Ladyship can't be too well off. Now you must not always play such sad music. Sometimes I think all will be well, something will surely turn up." And something did turn up. Effi desired to become a painter, in spite of the precentor's daughter from Polzin, whose conceit as an artist she still remembered as exceedingly disagreeable. Although she laughed about the plan herself, because she was conscious she could never rise above the lowest grade of dilettantism, Nevertheless, she went at her work with zest, because she had at last an occupation, and that, too, one after her own heart, because it was quiet and peaceful. She applied for instruction to a very old professor of painting, who was well informed concerning the Brandenburgian aristocracy, and was at the very same time very pious, so that Effi seemed to be his heart's delight from the outset. He probably thought, here was a soul to be saved, and so he received her with his extraordinary friendliness, as though she had been his daughter. This made Effi very happy, and the day of her first painting lesson marked for her a turning point toward the good. Her poor life was now no longer so poor, and Roswitha was triumphant when she saw that she had been right and something had turned up after all. Thus things went on for considerably over a year. Coming again in contact with people made Effi happy, but it also created within her the desire to renew and extend associations. Longing for Hohen Cremmen came over her at times with the force of a true passion, and she longed still more passionately to see Annie. After all, she was her child, and when she began to turn this thought over in her mind and, at the same time, recalled what Miss Trippelli had once said, to wit, "The world is so small that one could be certain of coming suddenly upon some old acquaintance in Central Africa," she had a reason for being surprised that she had never met Annie. But the time finally arrived when a change was to occur. She was coming from her painting lesson, close by the Zoological Garden, and near the station stepped into a horse car. It was very hot, and it did her good to see the lowered curtains blown out and back by the strong current of air passing through the car. She leaned back in the corner toward the front platform and was studying several pictures of blue tufted and tasseled sofas on a stained window pane, when the car began to move more slowly, and she saw 3 school children spring up with school bags on their backs and little pointed hats on their heads. 2 of them were blonde and merry, the third brunette and serious. This one was Annie. Effi was badly startled, and the thought of meeting with the child, for which she had so often longed, filled her now with deadly fright. What was to be done? With quick determination she opened the door to the front platform, on which nobody was standing but the driver, whom she asked to let her get off in front at the next station. "It is forbidden, young lady," said the driver, but she gave him a coin and looked at him so appealingly that the good-natured man changed his mind and mumbled to himself, "I really am not supposed to, but perhaps once will not matter." When the car stopped, he took out the lattice and Effi sprang off. She was still greatly excited when she reached the house. "Just think, Roswitha, I have seen Annie." Then she told of the meeting in the tram-car. Roswitha was displeased that the mother and daughter had not been rejoiced to see each other again, and was very hard to convince that it would not have looked well in the presence of so many people. Then Effi had to tell how Annie looked, and when she had done so with motherly pride, Roswitha said, "Yes, she is what one might call half and half. Her pretty features and, if I may be permitted to say it, her strange look she gets from her mother, but her seriousness is exactly her father. When I come to think about it, she is more like his lordship." "Thank God," said Effi. "Now, your ladyship, there is some question about that. No doubt there is many a person who would take the side of the mother." "Do you think so, Roswitha? I don't." Oh, I am not so easily fooled, and I think your ladyship knows very well, too, how matters really stand, and what the men like best." "Oh, don't speak of that, Roswitha." The conversation ended here and was never afterward resumed. But even though Effi avoided speaking to Roswitha about Annie, down deep in her heart she was unable to get over that meeting, and suffered from the thought of having fled from her own child. It troubled her till she was ashamed, and her desire to meet Annie grew till it became pathological. It was not possible to write to Innstetten and ask his permission. She was fully conscious of her guilt. Indeed, she nurtured the sense of it with almost zealous care. But on the other hand, at the same time that she was conscious of guilt, she was also filled with a certain spirit of rebellion against Innstetten. She said to herself, he was right again and again, and yet in the end he was wrong. All had happened so long before, a new life had begun. He might have let it die. Instead, poor Crampas died. No, it would not do to write to Innstetten. But she wanted to see Annie and speak to her and press her to her heart, and after she had thought it over for days, she was firmly convinced as to the best way to go about it. The very next morning she carefully put on a decent black dress and set out for Unter den Linden to call on the minister's wife. She sent in her card with nothing on it but Effi von Instetten, née von Briest. Everything else was left off, even Baroness. When the manservant returned and said, "Her Excellency begs you to enter," Effi followed him into an anteroom, where she sat down and, in spite of her excitement, looked at the pictures on the walls. First of all there was Guido Reni's Aurora, while opposite hung English etchings of pictures by Benjamin West, made by the well-known aquatint process. One of the pictures was King Lear in the storm on the heath. Effi had hardly finished looking at the pictures when the door of the adjoining room opened, and a tall slender woman of unmistakably prepossessing appearance stepped toward the one who had come to request a favor of her and held out her hand. "My dear, most gracious Lady," she said, "what a pleasure it is for me to see you again." As she said this, she walked toward the sofa and sat down, drawing Effi to a seat beside her. Effi was touched by the goodness of heart revealed in every word and movement. Not a trace of haughtiness or reproach, only beautiful human sympathy. "In what way can I be of service to you?" asked the minister's wife. Effi's lips quivered. Finally she said, "The thing that brings me here is a request, the fulfillment of which your Excellency may perhaps make possible. I have a 10-year-old daughter whom I have not seen for 3 years and I should like to see again." The minister's wife took Effi's hand and looked at her in a friendly way. "When I say not seen for 3 years, that is not quite right. 3 days ago I saw her again." Then Effi described with great vividness how she had met Annie. "Fleeing from my own child. I know very well that as we sow we shall reap, and I do not wish to change anything in my life. It is all right as it is, and I have not wished to have it otherwise. But this separation from my child is really too hard, and I have a desire to be permitted to see her now and then, not secretly and clandestinely, but with the knowledge and consent of all concerned." "With the knowledge and consent of all concerned," repeated the minister's wife. "So that means with the consent of your husband. I see that his bringing up of the child is calculated to estrange her from her mother, a method which I do not feel at liberty to judge. Perhaps he is right. Pardon me for this remark, gracious Lady." Effi nodded. "You yourself appreciate the attitude of your husband, and your only desire is that proper respect be shown to a natural impulse, indeed I may say the most beautiful of our impulses, at least we women all think so. Am I right?" "In every particular." "So you want me to secure permission for occasional meetings in your home where you can attempt to win back the heart of your child." Effi expressed again her acquiescence, and the minister's wife continued, "Then, most gracious Lady, I shall do what I can. But we shall not have an easy task. Your husband, pardon me for calling him by that name now as before, is a man who is not governed by moods and fancies but by principles, and it will be hard for him to discard them or even give them up temporarily. Otherwise he would have begun long ago to pursue a different method of action and education. What to your heart seems hard he considers right." "Then your Excellency thinks perhaps it would be better to take back my request?" "Oh no. I wished only to explain the actions of your husband, not to say justify them, and wished at the same time to indicate the difficulties which we shall in all probability encounter. But I think we shall overcome them nevertheless. We women are able to accomplish a great many things if we go about them wisely and do not make too great pretensions. Besides, your husband is one of my special admirers, and he cannot well refuse to grant what I request of him. Tomorrow we have a little circle meeting at which I shall see him, and the day after tomorrow morning you will receive a few lines from me telling you whether or not I have approached him wisely, that is to say, successfully. I think we shall come off victorious, and you will see your child again and enjoy her. She is said to be a very pretty girl. No wonder." End of chapter 32. Chapters 33 and 34 of Effi Briest by Theodor FONTANE, translated by William Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Chapter 33. 2 days later the promised lines arrived, and Effi read: "I am glad, dear gracious lady, to be able to give you good news. Everything turned out as desired. Your husband is too much of a man of the world to refuse a lady a request that she makes of him. But I must not keep from you the fact that I saw plainly his consent was not in accord with what he considers wise and right. But let us not pick faults where we ought to be glad. We have arranged that Annie is to come some time on Monday, and may good fortune attend your meeting." It was on the postman's second round that Effi received these lines, and it would presumably be less than 2 hours till Annie appeared. That was a short time, and yet too long. Effi walked restlessly about the 2 rooms, and then back to the kitchen, where she talked with Roswitha about everything imaginable, about the ivy over on Christ's Church, and the probability that next year the windows would be entirely overgrown, about the porter, who had again turned off the gas so poorly that they were likely to be blown up, and about buying their lamp oil again at the large lamp store on Unter den Linden instead of on Anhalt Street. She talked about everything imaginable except Annie, because she wished to keep down the fear lurking in her soul, in spite of the letter from the minister's wife, or perhaps because of it. Finally, at noon, the bell was rung timidly, and Roswitha went to look through the peephole. Surely enough it was Annie. Roswitha gave the child a kiss, but said nothing, and then led her very quietly, as though someone were ill in the house, from the corridor into the back room, and then to the door opening into the front room. "Go in there, Annie." With these words she left the child and returned to the kitchen, for she did not wish to be in the way. Effi was standing at the other end of the room with her back against the post of the mirror when the child entered. "Annie!" But Annie stood still by the half-opened door, partly out of embarrassment, but partly on purpose. Effi rushed to her, lifted her up, and kissed her. "Annie, my sweet child, how glad I am! Come, tell me." She took Annie by the hand and went toward the sofa to sit down. Annie stood and looked shyly at her mother, at the same time reaching her left hand toward the corner of the tablecloth hanging down near her. "Did you know, Annie, that I saw you one day?" "Yes, I thought you did." "Now tell me a great deal. How tall you have grown! And that is the scar there, Roswitha told me about it. You were always so wild and hoydenish in your playing. You get that from your mother, she was the same way. And at school? I fancy you are always at the head. You look to me as though you ought to be a model pupil and always bring home the best marks. I have heard also that Miss von Wedelstädt praises you. That is right. I was likewise ambitious, but I had no such good school. Mythology was always my best study. In what are you best?" "I don't know." "Oh, you know well enough. Pupils always know that. In what do you have the best marks?" "In religion." "Now, you see, you do know after all. Well, that is very fine. I was not so good in it, but it was probably due to the instruction. We only had a young man licensed to preach." "We had too." "Has he gone away?" Annie nodded. "Why did he leave?" "I don't know. Now we have the preacher again." "And you all love him dearly?" "Yes, and the two girls in the highest class are going to change their religion." "Oh, I understand. That is fine. And how is Johanna?" "Johanna brought me to the door of the house." "Why didn't you bring her up with you?" "She said she would rather stay downstairs and wait over at the church." "And are you to meet her there?" "Yes." "Well, I hope she will not get impatient. There is a little front yard over there, and the windows are half overgrown with ivy, as though it were an old church." "But I should not like to keep her waiting." "Oh, I see, you are very considerate, and I presume I ought to be glad of it. We only need to make the proper division of the time. Tell me now how Rollo is." "Rollo is very well, but papa says he is getting so lazy. He lies in the sun all the time." "That I can readily believe. He was that way when you were quite small. And now, Annie, today we have just seen each other, you know. Will you visit me often?" "Oh, certainly, if I am allowed to." "We can take a walk in the Prince Albrecht garden." "Oh, certainly, if I am allowed to." "Or we may go to Schilling's and eat ice cream, pineapple or vanilla ice cream. I always liked vanilla best." "Oh, certainly, if I am allowed to." At this third "if I am allowed to" the measure was full. Effi sprang up and flashed the child a look of indignation. "I believe it is high time you were going, Annie. Otherwise Johanna will get impatient." She rang the bell, and Roswitha, who was in the next room, entered immediately. "Roswitha, take Annie over to the church. Johanna is waiting there. I hope she has not taken cold. I should be sorry. Remember me to Johanna." The two went out. Hardly had Roswitha closed the door behind her when Effi tore open her dress, because she was threatened with suffocation, and fell to laughing convulsively. So that is the way it goes to meet after a long separation. She rushed forward, opened the window and looked for something to support her. In the distress of her heart she found it. There beside the window was a bookshelf with a few volumes of Schiller and Körner on it, and on top of the volumes of poems, which were of equal height, lay a Bible and a song book. She reached for them because she had to have something before which she could kneel down and pray. She laid both Bible and song book on the edge of the table where Annie had been standing, and threw herself violently down before them and spoke in a half audible tone. "O God in heaven, forgive me what I have done. I was a child. No, no, I was not a child. I was old enough to know what I was doing. I did know, too, and I will not minimize my guilt. But this is too much. This action of the child is not the work of my God who would punish me. It is the work of Him alone. I thought He had a noble heart and have always felt small beside Him, but now I know that it is He who is small, and because He is small He is cruel. Everything that's small is cruel. He taught the child to say that. He was always a schoolmaster. Krampus called him one scoffingly at the time, but he was right." "Oh, certainly, if I am allowed to." "You don't have to be allowed to. I don't want you any more. I hate you both, even my own child. Too much is too much. He was ambitious, but nothing more. Honor, honor, honor. And then he shot the poor fellow, whom I never even loved, and whom I had forgotten because I didn't love him. It was all stupidity in the first place, but then came the blood and murder, with me to blame, and now he sends me the child because he cannot refuse a minister's wife anything, and before he sends the child he trains it like a parrot and teaches it the phrase 'if I am allowed to.' I am disgusted at what I did, but the thing that disgusts me most is your virtue. Away with you. I must live, but I doubt if it will be long." When Roswitha came back, Effi lay on the floor seemingly lifeless, with her face turned away. Chapter 34. Rummschüttel was called and pronounced Effi's condition serious. He saw that the hectic flush he had noticed for over a year was more pronounced than ever, and, what was worse, she showed the first symptoms of nervous fever. But his quiet, friendly manner, to which he added a dash of humor, did Effi good, and she was calm so long as Rummschüttel was with her. When he left, Roswitha accompanied him as far as the outer hall and said: "My, how I am scared, Sir Councillor, if it ever comes back, and it may. Oh, I shall never have another quiet hour. But it was too much the way the child acted. Her poor ladyship, and still so young, at her age many are only beginning life." "Don't worry, Roswitha, it may all come right again. But she must get away, we will see to that. Different air, different people." 2 days later there arrived in Hohen Cremmen a letter which ran: "Most gracious Lady, my long-standing friendly relations to the houses of Briest and Belling, and above all the hearty love I cherish for your daughter, will justify these lines. Things cannot go on any longer as they are. Unless something is done to rescue your daughter from the loneliness and sorrow of the life she has been leading for years, she will soon pine away. She always had a tendency to consumption, for which reason I sent her to Ems years ago. This old trouble is now aggravated by a new one. Her nerves are giving out. Nothing but a change of air can check this. But whither shall I send her? It would not be hard to make a proper choice among the watering places of Silesia. Salzbrunn is good, and Reinerz still better, on account of the nervous complication. But no place except Hohen Cremmen will do. For, most gracious Lady, air alone cannot restore your daughter's health. She is pining away because she has nobody but Roswitha. The fidelity of a servant is beautiful, but parental love is better. Pardon an old man for meddling in affairs that lie outside of his calling as a physician. No, not outside either, for after all it is the physician who is here speaking and making demands, pardon the word, in accordance with his duty. I have seen so much of life. But enough on this topic. With kindest regards to your husband, your humble servant, Dr. Rummschüttel." Mrs. von Briest had read the letter to her husband. They were sitting on the shady tile walk, with their backs to the drawing room, and facing the circular bed and the sundial. The wild grapevine twining around the windows was rustling gently in the breeze, and over the water a few dragonflies were hovering in the bright sunshine. Briest sat speechless, drumming on the tea tray. "Please don't drum. I had rather you would talk." "Ah, Luise, what shall I say? My drumming says quite enough. You have known for over a year what I think about it. At the time when Innstetten's letter came, a flash from a clear sky, I was of your opinion. But that was half an eternity ago. Am I to play the Grand Inquisitor till the end of my days? I tell you I've had my fill of it for a long time." "Don't reproach me, Briest. I love her as much as you, perhaps more, each in his own way. But it is not our only purpose in life to be weak and affectionate and to tolerate things that are contrary to the law and the commandments, things that men condemn, and in the present instance rightly." "Hold on, one thing comes first." "Of course one thing comes first, but what is the one thing?" "The love of parents for their children, especially when they have only one child." "Then good bye catechism, morality, and the claims of society." "Ah, Luise, talk to me about the catechism as much as you like, but don't speak to me about society." "It's very hard to get along without society." "Also without a child. Believe me, Luise, society can shut one eye when it sees fit. Here is where I stand in the matter. If the people of Rathenow come, all right. If they don't come, all right too. I am simply going to telegraph, 'Effi, come.' Are you agreed?" She got up and kissed him on the forehead. "Of course I am. Only you must not find fault with me. An easy step it is not, and from now on our life will be different." "I can stand it. There is a good rape crop and in the autumn I can hunt an occasional hare. I still have a taste for red wine, and it will taste even better when we have the child back in the house. Now I'm going to send the telegram." Effi had been in Hohen Cremmen for over 6 months. She occupied the 2 rooms on the second floor which she had formerly had when there for a visit. The larger one was furnished for her personally, and Roswitha slept in the other. What Rummschuttel had expected from this sojourn and the good that went with it was realized, so far as it could be realized. The coughing diminished, the bitter expression that had robbed Effi's unusually kind face of a good part of its charm disappeared, and there came days when she could laugh again. About Kessin and everything back there little was said, with the single exception of Mrs. von Padden, and Gieshiibler, of course, for whom old Mr. von Briest had a very tender spot in his heart. "This Alonso, this fastidious Spaniard, who harbors a Mirambo and brings up a Trippelli, well, he must be a genius, and you can't make me believe he isn't." Then Effi had to yield and act for him the part of Gieshiibler with hat in hand and endless bows of politeness. By virtue of her peculiar talent for mimicry she could do the bows very well, although it went against the grain, because she always felt that it was an injustice to the dear good man. They never talked about Innstetten and Annie, but it was settled that Annie was to inherit Hohen Cremmen. Effi took a new lease on life, and her mother, who in true womanly fashion was not altogether averse to regarding the affair, painful though it was, as merely an interesting case, vied with her father in expressions of love and devotion. "Such a good winter we have not had for a long time," said Briest. Then Effi arose from her seat and stroked back the sparse hairs from his forehead. But beautiful as everything seemed from the point of view of Effi's health, it was all illusion, for in reality the disease was gaining ground and quietly consuming her vitality. Effi again wore, as on the day of her betrothal to Innstetten, a blue and white striped smock with a loose belt, and when she walked up to her parents with a quick elastic step to bid them good morning they looked at each other with joyful surprise and yet at the same time with sadness, for they could not fail to see that it was not the freshness of youth, but a transformation that gave her slender form and beaming eyes this peculiar appearance. All who observed her closely saw this, but Effi herself did not. Her whole attention was engaged by the happy feeling at being back in this place, to her so charmingly peaceful, and living reconciled with those whom she had always loved and who had always loved her, even during the years of her misery and exile. She busied herself with all sorts of things about the home and attended to the decorations and little improvements in the household. Her appreciation of the beautiful enabled her always to make the right choice. Reading, and above all, study of the arts, she had given up entirely. "I have had so much of it that I am happy to be able to lay my hands in my lap." Besides, it doubtless reminded her too much of her days of sadness. She cultivated instead the art of contemplating nature with calmness and delight, and when the leaves fell from the plane trees, or the sunbeams glistened on the ice of the little pond, or the first crocuses blossomed in the circular plot, still half in the grip of winter, it did her good, and she could gaze on all these things for hours, forgetting what life had denied her, or, to be more accurate, what she had robbed herself of. Callers were not altogether a minus quantity. Not everybody shunned her, but her chief associates were the families at the schoolhouse and the parsonage. It made little difference that the Jahnke daughters had left home, there could have been no very cordial friendship with them anyhow. But she found a better friend than ever in old Mr. Jahnke himself, who considered not only all of Swedish Pomerania, but also the Kesen region as Scandinavian outposts, and was always asking questions about them. "Why, Jahnke, we had a steamer, and as I wrote to you, I believe, or maybe, perhaps have told you, I came very near to going over to Visby. Just think, I almost went to Visby. It is comical, but I can say almost with reference to many things in my life." A pity," said Jahnke. "Yes, indeed, a pity. But I actually did make a tour of Rügen. You would have enjoyed that, Jahnke. Just think, Arkona with its great camping place of the Wends that is said still to be visible. I myself did not go there, but not very far away is the Hertha Lake with white and yellow water lilies. The place made one think a great deal of your Hertha." "Yes, yes, Hertha. But you were about to speak of the Hertha Lake." "Yes, I was. And just think, Jahnke, close by the lake stood two large shining sacrificial stones with the grooves still showing, in which the blood used to run off. Ever since then I have had an aversion for the Wends." "Oh, pardon me, gracious lady, but they were not Wends. The legends of the sacrificial stones and the Hertha Lake go back much, much farther, clear back before the birth of Christ. They were the pure Germans, from whom we are all descended." "Of course," laughed Effi, "from whom we are all descended, the Jahnkes certainly, and perhaps the Briests too." Then she dropped the subject of Rügen and the Hertha Lake, and asked about his grandchildren and which of them he liked best, Bertha's or Hertha's. Indeed, Effi was on a very friendly footing with Jahnke, but in spite of his intimate relation to Hertha Lake, Scandinavia, and Visby, he was only a simple man, and so the lonely young woman could not fail to value her chats with Niemeyer much higher. In the autumn, so long as promenades in the park were possible, she had an abundance of such chats, but with the beginning of winter came an interruption for several months, because she did not like to go to the parsonage. Mrs. Niemeyer had always been a very disagreeable woman, but she pitched her voice higher than ever now, in spite of the fact that in the opinion of the parish she herself was not altogether above reproach. The situation remained the same throughout the winter, much to Effi's sorrow. But at the beginning of April, when the bushes showed a fringe of green, and the park paths dried off, the walks were resumed. Once when they were sauntering along they heard a cuckoo in the distance, and Effi began to count to see how many times it called. She was leaning on Niemeyer's arm. Suddenly she said, "The cuckoo is calling yonder, but I don't want to consult him about the length of my life. Tell me, friend, what do you think of life?" "Ah, dear Effi, you must not lay such doctor's questions before me. You must apply to a philosopher or offer a prize to a faculty. What do I think of life? Much and little. Sometimes it is very much, and sometimes very little." "That is right, friend, I like that. I don't need to know any more." As she said this they came to the swing. She sprang into it as in her earliest girlhood days, and before the old man, who watched her, could recover from his fright, she crouched down between the two ropes and set the swing board in motion by a skilful lifting and dropping of the weight of her body. In a few seconds she was flying through the air. Then, holding on with only one hand, she tore a little silk handkerchief from around her neck and waved it happily and haughtily. Soon she let the swing stop, sprang out, and took Niemeyer's arm again. "Effi, you are just as you always were." "No, I wish I were. But I am too old for this. I just wanted to try it once more. Oh, how fine it was, and how much good the air did me. It seemed as though I were flying up to heaven. I wonder if I shall go to heaven. Please tell me, friend, you ought to know. Please, please. Niemeyer took her hand into his two wrinkled ones and gave her a kiss on the forehead, saying, "Yes, Effi, you will." Chapter 35 of Effi Briest by Theodor FONTANE, translated by William Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Effi spent the whole day out in the park because she needed to take the air. Old Dr. Wiesike of Friesack approved of it, but in his instructions gave her too much liberty to do what she liked, and during the cold days in May she took a severe cold. She became feverish, coughed a great deal, and the doctor, who had been calling every third day, now came daily. He was put to it to know what to do, for the sleeping powders and cough medicines Effi asked for could not be given because of the fever. "Doctor," said old von Briest, "what is going to come of this? You have known her since she was a little thing. In fact, you were here at her birth. I don't like all these symptoms. Her noticeable falling away, the red spots, and the gleam of her eyes when she suddenly turns to me with a pleading look. What do you think it will amount to? Must she die?" Wiesike shook his head gravely. "I will not say that, von Briest, but I don't like the way her fever keeps up. However, we shall bring it down soon, for she must go to Switzerland or Mentone for pure air and agreeable surroundings that will make her forget the past." "Lethe, Lethe." "Yes, Lethe," smiled Wiesike. "It's a pity that while the ancient Swedes, the Greeks, were leaving us the name, they did not leave us also the spring itself." "Or at least the formula for it. Waters are imitated now, you know. My, Wiesike, what a business we could build up here if we could only start such a sanatorium. Friesack, the spring of forgetfulness. Well, let us try the Riviera for the present. Mentone is the Riviera, is it not? To be sure, the price of grain is low just now, but what must be, must be. I shall talk with my wife about it." That he did, and his wife consented immediately, influenced in her part by her own ardent desire to see the South, particularly since she had felt like one retired from the world, but Effi would not listen to it. "How good you are to me, and I am selfish enough to accept the sacrifice, if I thought it would do any good, but I am certain it would only harm me." "You try to make yourself think that, Effi." "No. I've become so irritable that everything annoys me. Not here at home, for you humor me and clear everything out of the way, but when traveling that is impossible. The disagreeable element cannot be eliminated so easily. It begins with the conductor and ends with the waiter. Even when I merely think of their self-satisfied countenances, my temperature runs right up. No, no, keep me here. I don't care to leave Hohen any more. My place is here. The heliotrope around the sundial is dearer to me than Mentone." After this conversation the plan was dropped, and in spite of the great benefit Wiesike had expected from the Riviera, he said, "We must respect these wishes, for they are not mere whims. Such patients have a very fine sense, and know with remarkable certainty what is good for them and what not. What Mrs. Effi has said about the conductor and the waiter is really quite correct, and there is no air with healing power enough to counterbalance hotel annoyances, if one is at all affected by them. So let us keep her here. If that is not the best thing, it is certainly not the worst." This proved to be true. Effi got better, gained a little in weight (old von Briest belonged to the weight fanatics), and lost much of her irritability. But her need of fresh air kept growing steadily, and even when the west wind blew and the sky was overcast with grey clouds, she spent many hours out of doors. On such days she would usually go out into the fields or the marsh, often as far as 2 miles, and when she grew tired she would sit down on the hurdle fence where, lost in dreams, She would watch the ranunculi and red sorrel waving in the wind. "You go out so much alone," said Mrs. von Briest. "Among our people you are safe, but there are so many strange vagabonds prowling around." That made an impression on Effi, who had never thought of danger, and when she was alone with Roswitha she said: "I can't well take you with me, Roswitha. You are too fat and no longer sure-footed." "Oh, your Ladyship, it is hardly yet as bad as that. Why, I could still be married." "Of course," laughed Effi. "One is never too old for that. But let me tell you, Roswitha, if I had a dog to accompany me— Papa's hunting dog has no attachment for me, hunting dogs are so stupid, and he never stirs till the hunter or the gardener takes the gun from the rack. I often have to think of Rollo." "True," said Roswitha. "They have nothing like Rollo here. But I don't mean anything against here. Hohen Cremmen is very good." 3 or 4 days after this conversation between Effi and Roswitha, Innstetten entered his office an hour earlier than usual. The morning sun, which shone very brightly, had wakened him, and as he had doubtless felt he could not go to sleep again, he had got out of bed to take up a piece of work that had long been waiting to be attended to. At 8:15 he rang. Johanna brought the breakfast tray, on which, beside the morning papers, there were 2 letters. He glanced at the addresses and recognized by the handwriting that one was from the Minister. But the other? The postmark could not be read plainly, and the address, Baron von Instetten, Esquire, showed a happy lack of familiarity with the customary use of titles. In keeping with this was the very primitive character of the writing. But the address was remarkably accurate: West Keith Street, 1st, 3rd story. Innstetten was enough of an official to open the first letter from His Excellency. "My dear Innstetten, I am happy to be able to announce to you that His Majesty has deigned to sign your appointment, and I congratulate you sincerely." Innstetten was pleased at the friendly lines from the Minister, almost more than the appointment itself, for since the morning in Kessin, when Crampas had bidden him farewell, with that look which still haunted him, he had grown somewhat sceptical of such things as climbing higher on the ladder. Since then he had measured with a different measure and viewed things in a different light. Distinction, what did that amount to in the end? As the days passed by with less and less joy for him, he more than once recalled a half forgotten minister's anecdote from the time of the elder Lattenberg, who, upon receiving the Order of the Red Eagle, for which he had long been waiting, threw it down in a rage and exclaimed, "Lie there till you turn black." It probably did turn into a black one subsequently, but many days too late, and certainly without real satisfaction for the receiver. Everything that is to give us pleasure must come at the right time and in the right circumstances, for what delights us today may be valueless tomorrow. Innstetten felt this deeply, and as certainly as he had formerly laid store by honors and distinctions coming from his highest superiors, just so certainly was he now firmly convinced that the glittering appearance of things amounted to but little, and that what is called happiness, if it existed at all, is something other than this appearance. "Happiness, if I am right, lies in 2 things: being exactly where one belongs. But what official can say that of himself? And especially performing comfortably the most commonplace functions, that is, getting enough sleep, and not having new boots that pinch. When the 720 minutes of a 12-hour day pass without any special annoyance, that can be called a happy day." Innstetten was today in the mood for such gloomy reflections. When he took up the second letter and read it, he ran his head over his forehead, with a painful feeling that there is such a thing as happiness, that he had once possessed it, but had lost it and could never again recover it. Johanna entered and announced Privy Councillor Wüllersdorf, who was already standing on the threshold, and said: "Congratulations, Innstetten." "I believe you mean what you say. The others will be vexed. However—" "However! You are surely not going to be pessimistic at a moment like this." "No. The graciousness of His Majesty makes me feel ashamed, and the friendly feeling of the Minister, to whom I owe all this, almost more. But I have forgotten how to rejoice. If I said that to anybody but you, my words would be considered empty phrases, but you understand me. Just look around you, how empty and deserted everything is. When Johanna comes in, a so-called jewel, she startles me and frightens me. Her stage entry," continued Innstetten, imitating Johanna's pose, "the half-comical shapeliness of her bust, which comes forward claiming special attention, whether of mankind or me, I don't know, all this strikes me as so sad and pitiable, and if it were not so ridiculous it might drive me to suicide." "Dear Innstetten, are you going to assume the duties of a permanent secretary in this frame of mind?" "Oh, bah, how can I help it? Read these lines I have just received." Wüllersdorf took the second letter with the illegible postmark, was amused at the Esquire, and stepped to the window that he might read more easily. "Gracious Sir, I suppose you will be surprised that I am writing to you, but it is about Rollo. Little Annie told us last year Rollo was so lazy now, but that doesn't matter here. He can be as lazy as he likes here, the lazier the better, and her ladyship would like it so much. She always says when she walks upon the marsh or over the fields, 'I really am afraid, Roswitha, because I am so alone, but who is there to accompany me? Rollo, oh yes, he would do. He bears no grudge against me either.' That is the advantage, that animals do not trouble themselves so much about such things. These are her ladyship's words, and I will say nothing further, and merely ask your Lordship to remember me to my little Annie, also to Johanna. From your faithful, most obedient servant, Roswitha Gellenhagen." "Well," said Wüllersdorf, as he folded the letter again, "she is ahead of us." "I think so too." "This is also the reason why everything else seems so doubtful to you." "You're right. It has been going through my head for a long time, and these simple words with their intended, or perhaps unintended, complaint have put me completely beside myself again. It has been troubling me for over a year, and I should like to get clear out of here. Nothing pleases me any more. The more distinctions I receive, the more I feel that it is all vanity. My life is bungled, and so I have thought to myself I ought to have nothing more to do with strivings and vanities, and ought to be able to employ my pedagogical inclinations, which, after all, are my most characteristic quality, as a superintendent of public morals. It would not be anything new. If the plan were feasible, I should surely become a very famous character, such as Dr. Wichern of the Rough House in Hamburg, for example, that man of miracles who tamed all criminals with his glance and his piety. There's nothing to be said against that. It would be possible." "No, it is not possible either, not even that. Absolutely every avenue is closed to me. How could I touch the soul of a murderer? To do that one must be intact himself, and if one no longer is, but has a like spot on his own hands, then he must at least be able to play the crazy penitent before his confrères, who are to be converted, and entertain them with a scene of gigantic contrition." Wüllersdorf nodded. "Now you see, you agree. But I can't do any of these things any more. I can no longer play the man in the hair shirt, let alone the dervish or the fakir who dances himself to death in the midst of his self-accusations. And inasmuch as all such things are impossible, I have puzzled out, as the best thing for me, to go away from here and off to the coal black fellows who know nothing of culture and honour. Those fortunate creatures! For culture and honour and such rubbish are to blame for all my trouble. We don't do such things out of a passion, which might be an acceptable excuse. We do them for the sake of mere notions. Notions. And then the one fellow collapses, and later the other collapses too, only in a worse way." "Oh, pshaw! Innstetten, those are whims, mere fancies. Go to Africa? What does that mean?" "It will do for a lieutenant who is in debt. But a man like you? Are you thinking of presiding over a palaver in a red fez, or of entering into a blood relationship with the son-in-law of King Mtesa? Or will you feel your way along the Congo in a tropical helmet with 6 holes in the top of it until you come out again at Cameroon or thereabouts? Impossible." "Impossible? Why? If that is impossible, what then?" "Simply stay here and practice resignation. Who, pray, is unoppressed? Who could not say every day, 'Really, a very questionable affair'? You know, I have also a small burden to bear, not the same as yours, but not much lighter. That talk about creeping around in the primeval forest or spending the night in an ant-hill is folly. Whoever cares to, may, but it is not the thing for us. The best thing is to stand in the gap and hold out till one falls, but until then to get as much out of life as possible in the small and even the smallest things, keeping one eye open for the violets when they bloom, or the Louisa monument when it is decorated with flowers, or the little girls with high lace shoes when they skip the rope, or drive out to Potsdam and go into the Church of Peace where the Emperor Frederick lies and where they are just beginning to build him a tomb. As you stand there, consider the life of that man, and if you are not pacified then, there is no help for you, I should say." "Good, good. But the year is long, and every single day, and then the evening." "That is always the easiest part of the day to know what to do with. Then we have Sardanapal or Coppelia with Del Era, and when that is out we have Ziechens, which is not to be despised. 3 steins will calm you every time. There are always many, a great many others, who are in exactly the same general situation as we are, and one of them who had a great deal of misfortune once said to me, 'Believe me, Wüllersdorf, we cannot get along without false work.' The man who said it was an architect and must have known about it. His statement is correct. Never a day passes but I am reminded of the false work." After Wüllersdorf had thus expressed himself, he took his hat and cane. During these words Innstetten may have recalled his own earlier remarks about little happiness, for he nodded his head half agreeing and smiled to himself. "Where are you going now, Wüllersdorf? It is too early yet for the ministry." "I'm not going there at all today. First I shall take an hour's walk along the canal to the Charlottenburg lock, and then back again, and then make a short call at Huth's on Potsdam Street, going cautiously up the little wooden stairway. Below there is a flower store." "And that affords you pleasure? What satisfies you?" "I should not say that exactly, but it will help a bit. I shall find various regular guests there drinking their morning glass, but their names I wisely keep secret. One will tell about the Duke of Ratibor, another about the Prince Bishop Kopp, and a third perhaps about Bismarck. There is always a little something to be learned. 3/4 of what is said is inaccurate, but if it is only witty I do not waste much time criticizing it and always listen gratefully." With that he went out. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Effi Briest by Theodor FONTANE, translated by William Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Margaret Espaillat. May was beautiful, June more beautiful, and after Effi had happily overcome the first painful feeling aroused in her by Rollo's arrival, she was full of joy at having the faithful dog about her again. Roswitha was praised, and old von Briest launched forth into words of recognition for Innstetten, who, he said, was a cavalier, never petty, but always stout-hearted. What a pity that the stupid affair had to come between them. As a matter of fact, they were a model couple. The only one who remained calm during the welcoming scene was Rollo himself, who either had no appreciation of time or considered the separation as an irregularity which was now simply removed. The fact that he had grown old also had something to do with it, no doubt. He remained sparing with his demonstrations of affection as he had been with his evidences of joy during the welcoming scene, but he had grown in fidelity, if such a thing were possible. He never left the side of his mistress. The hunting dog he treated benevolently, but as a being of a lower order. At night he lay on the rush mat before Effi's door. In the morning, when breakfast was served out of doors by the sundial, he was always quiet, always sleepy, and only when Effi arose from the breakfast table and walked toward the hall to take her straw hat and umbrella from the rack did his youth return. Then, without troubling himself about whether his strength was to be put to a hard or easy test, he ran up the village road and back again, and did not calm down till they were out in the fields. Effi, who cared more for fresh air than for landscape beauty, avoided the little patches of forest and usually kept to the main road, which at first was bordered with very old elms and then, where the turnpike began, with poplars. This road led to the railway station about an hour's walk away. She enjoyed everything, breathing in with delight the fragrance wafted to her from the rape and clover fields, or watching the soaring of the larks, and counting the draw-wells and troughs to which the cattle went to drink. She could hear a soft ringing of bells that made her feel as though she must close her eyes and pass away in sweet forgetfulness. Near the station, close by the turnpike, lay a road-roller. This was her daily resting place, from which she could observe what took place on the railroad. Trains came and went, and sometimes she could see two columns of smoke, which for a moment seemed to blend into one and then separated, one going to the right, the other to the left, till they disappeared behind the village and the grove. Rollo sat beside her, sharing her lunch, and when he had caught the last bite he would run like mad along some ploughed furrow, doubtless to show his gratitude, and stop only when a pair of pheasants, scared from their nest, flew up from a neighboring furrow close by him. "How beautiful this summer is! A year ago, dear mamma, I should not have thought I could ever again be so happy," said Effi every day as she walked with her mother around the pond or picked an early apple from a tree and bit into it vigorously, for she had beautiful teeth. Mrs. von Briest would stroke her hand and say, "Just wait till you are well again, Effi, quite well, and then we shall find happiness, not that of the past, but a new kind. Thank God, there are several kinds of happiness, and you shall see we shall find something for you." "You are so good. Really, I have changed your lives and made you prematurely old." "Oh, my dear Effi, don't speak of it. I thought the same about it when the change came. Now I know that our quiet is better than the noise and loud turmoil of earlier years. If you keep on as you are, we can go away yet. When Wiesike proposed Mentone, you were ill and irritable, and because you were ill, you were right in saying what you did about conductors and waiters. When you have steadier nerves again you can stand that. You will no longer be offended, but will laugh at the grand manners and the curled hair. Then the blue sea and white sails, and rocks all overgrown with red cactus. I've never seen them, to be sure, but that is how I imagine them. I should like to become acquainted with them." Thus the summer went by, and the meteoric showers were also past. During these evenings Effi had sat at her window till after midnight, and yet never grew tired of watching. "I was always a weak Christian, but I wonder whether we ever came from up there, and whether, when all is over here, we shall return to our heavenly home, to the stars above or further beyond? I don't know and don't care to know. I just have the longing." Poor Effi! She had looked up at the wonders of the sky and thought about them too long, with the result that the night air and the fog rising from the pond made her so ill she had to stay in bed again. When Wiesike was summoned and had examined her, he took Briest aside and said: "No more hope. Be prepared for an early end." What he said was only too true, and a few days later, comparatively early in the evening, it was not yet 10 o'clock, Roswitha came downstairs and said to Mrs. von Briest: "Most gracious Lady, her Ladyship upstairs is very ill. She talks continually to herself in a soft voice, and sometimes it seems as though she were praying, but she says she is not, and I don't know. It seems to me as though the end might come any hour." "Does she wish to speak to me?" "She hasn't said so, but I believe she does. You know how she is. She doesn't want to disturb you and make you anxious, but I think it would be well." "All right, Roswitha, I will come." Before the clock began to strike, Mrs. von Briest mounted the stairway and entered Effi's room. Effi lay on a reclining chair near the open window. Mrs. von Briest drew up a small black chair with 3 gilt spindles in its ebony back, took Effi's hand and said: "How are you, Effi? Roswitha says you are so feverish." "Oh, Roswitha worries so much about everything. I could see by her looks she thought I was dying. Well, I don't know. She thinks everybody ought to be as much worried as she is." "Are you so calm about dying, dear Effi?" "Entirely calm, mama." "Aren't you deceiving yourself? Everybody clings to life, especially the young, and you are still so young, dear Effi." Effi remained silent for a while. Then she said: "You know, I haven't read much. Innstetten was often surprised at it, and he didn't like it." This was the first time she had mentioned Innstetten's name, and it made a deep impression on her mother and showed clearly that the end was come. "But I thought," said Mrs. von Briest, "you were going to tell me something." "Yes, I was, because you spoke of my still being so young. Certainly I am still young, but that makes no difference. During our happy days, Innstetten used to read aloud to me in the evening. He had very good books, and in one of them there was a story about a man who had been called away from a merry table. The following morning he asked how it had been after he left. Somebody answered, 'Oh, there were all sorts of things, but you really didn't miss anything.' You see, mama, these words have impressed themselves upon my memory. It doesn't signify very much if one is called away from the table a little early." Mrs. von Briest remained silent. Effi lifted herself up a little higher and said: "Now that I have talked to you about old times and also about Innstetten, I must tell you something else, dear mama." "You are getting excited, Effi." "No, no, to tell about the burden of my heart will not excite me, it will quiet me. And so I wanted to tell you that I am dying reconciled to God and men, reconciled also to Him." "Did you cherish in your heart such great bitterness against him? Really, pardon me, my dear Effi, for mentioning it now, really it was you who brought down sorrow upon yourself and your husband." Effi assented. "Yes, mama, and how sad that it should be so. But when all the terrible things happened, and finally the scene with Annie, you know what I mean, I turned the tables on him mentally, if I may use the ridiculous comparison, and came to believe seriously that he was to blame, because he was prosaic and calculating, and toward the end cruel. Then curses upon him crossed my lips." "Does that trouble you now?" "Yes, and I am anxious that he shall know how, during my last days of illness here, which have been almost my happiest, how it has become clear to my mind that he was right in his every act. In the affair with poor Crampas, well, after all, what else could he have done? Then the act by which he wounded me most deeply, the teaching of my own child to shun me, even in that he was right, hard and painful as it is for me to admit it. Let him know that I died in this conviction. It will comfort and console him and may reconcile him. He has much that is good in his nature, and he was as noble as anybody can be who is not truly in love." Mrs. von Briest saw that Effi was exhausted and seemed to be either sleeping or about to go to sleep. She rose quietly from her chair and went out. Hardly had she gone when Effi also got up and sat at the open window to breathe in the cool night air once more. The stars glittered and not a leaf stirred in the park, but the longer she listened, the more plainly she again heard something like soft rain falling on the plane trees. A feeling of liberation came over her. Rest, rest. It was a month later and September was drawing to an end. The weather was beautiful, but the foliage in the park began to show a great deal of red and yellow, and since the equinox which had brought 3 stormy days, the leaves lay scattered in every direction. In the circular plot a slight change had been made. The sundial was gone, and in the place where it had stood there lay since yesterday a white marble slab with nothing on it but Effi Briest and a cross beneath. This had been Effi's last request. "I should like to have back my old name on my stone. I brought no honor to the other." This had been promised her. The marble slab had arrived and had been placed in position yesterday, and Briest and his wife were sitting in view of it, looking at it and the heliotrope, which had been spared and which now bordered the stone. Rollo lay beside them with his head on his paws. Wilke, whose spats were growing wider and wider, brought the breakfast and the mail, and old Mr. von Briest said: "Wilke, order the little carriage. I am going to drive across the country with my wife." Mrs. von Briest had meanwhile poured the coffee and was looking at the circle and its flower bed. "See, Briest, Rollo is lying by the stone again. He is really taking it harder than we. He won't eat any more either." "Well, Luise, it is the brute creature. That is just what I have always said. We don't amount to as much as we think, but here we always talk about instinct. In the end I think it is the best." "Don't speak that way. When you begin to philosophize, don't take offense, Briest, you show your incompetence. You have a good understanding, but you can't tackle such questions." "That's true." "And if it is absolutely necessary to discuss questions that are entirely different ones, Briest, and I can tell you that not a day passes since the poor child has been lying there, but such questions press themselves on me." "What questions?" "Whether, after all, we are perhaps not to blame." "Nonsense, Luise, what do you mean?" "Whether we ought not to have disciplined her differently. You and I particularly, for Niemeyer is only a cipher, he leaves everything in doubt. And then, Briest, sorry as I am, your continual use of ambiguous expressions, and finally, and here I accuse myself too, for I do not desire to come off innocent in this matter, I wonder if she was not too young, perhaps." Rollo, who awoke at these words, shook his head gravely, and Briest said calmly: "Oh, Luise, don't. That is too wide a field." Chapter 36. End of Effi Briest by Theodor FONTANE, translated by William Cooper.